Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me at this final event. It's been a long, very challenging in some of the best ways. It's been a long project for us and during COVID. And so I am excited to meet the end of the activities and to be able to. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. There's a bit of an echo. Okay. Can I be allowed to share my screen, please? I would like to show some slides. Thank you. All right. So I am the research officer in graduate studies and research for the University of the West Indies Open Campus. I came to this project in my previous role as officer in charge of the Antigua site, which is a partner in this in the entire project of the CITES Antigua and Barbuda for LGBTI and child rights. So this is a bit of my background. Can everyone see my screen before I begin sharing? Yes?
Yes, I
Right.
have.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I have about half an hour to tell you about a year and a half worth of research, and I think I'm going to do my best because I want to begin by thanking everyone who was involved in putting the project together, from the members you see on the screen, our field researchers, Corey Norton and Anne Harewood George. I'm not sure if they're in the room in Antigua and Barbuda, where they're based. Ms. Wong, of course, who not as just as a project partner, but in her own way as a research contributor, giving us insider knowledge, access to our network of participants, giving us engagement with stakeholders and advice in her previous research endeavors on how to approach the research. So she was quite invaluable in the process of conducting the research in Antigua and Barbuda, particularly given in the Barbuda context. And our peer reviewer, Anika Gray, who will present after. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who has made the outcome of this research richer by their participation. We had some support from the Consortium for Social Development and Research at the University of the West Indies Open Campus, who assisted in some of the sorting of the collection and the transcriptions and so on. So we had a lot of support on this team, and I'm really, really grateful, particularly to the field researchers who conducted these interviews and went out in the field during the worst part of COVID-19, the pandemic, and made this research possible despite all of the global challenges that we were facing. Excuse me. So the goal of the research study is to provide relevant data on the status of stigma and discrimination against LGBTI persons in Antigua and Barbuda, with a view to inform policy on human rights issues at the national level. The goal of this is to always, the approach of the research is a human rights approach, and the research, as with other DCDIS projects, is really invested in human rights and making sure that human rights and cultural rights are available to all citizens, all residents, all global citizens. And this project is no different in that way. And the goal is to ensure that policy that responds to human rights issues and the stigma and discrimination that may be violating human rights are acknowledged and acted upon by virtue of understanding the climate of what's happening in Antigua and Barbuda. So one of the things that we recognize is lack of relevant data on lived experiences of persons in Antigua and Barbuda who identify as LGBTQI+. At the beginning, you will see the change in terminology during this project. It's because we began with LGBTI+, and the research shows that includes to be more inclusive in terms of queer identifying, questioning persons, including the Q and the plus. So it's a broadening definition of persons based on where we've arrived in the research as well. in small Caribbean societies with strong religious values and attitudes of social conservatism, there's a strong presence of discrimination against the LGBTI community. This is something that we established in understanding the climate that we're entering into this research. And this study seeks to establish the types and extent of discrimination taking place, with a view, like I said, to inform policy on how to improve and recommendations. I know Ms. Gray will focus quite heavily on recommendations in her presentation. I will offer some recommendations based on our research at the end of this presentation. Let's see. So we began with some broad research questions based on our preliminary research, some basic assumptions about Antigua and Barbuda as a twin island state that is small, that is heavily Christian in its denominations, that has, like many other Eastern Caribbean countries, cultural attitudes and historical context that influence how people of identifying as LGBTQ plus are perceived in society. And so we wanted to find out what are the main forms of discrimination affecting persons in Antigua and Barbuda. To what extent do the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of Antigua and Barbuda residents lead to stigma about and discrimination against LGBTI persons? How do LGBTI persons understand and respond to this stigma and discrimination that they experience? And to what extent do the laws, systems, and institutional structures within Antigua and Barbuda support the human rights of LGBTI individuals? And you see here we have law, systems, and institutional structures because there are overlaps, but there are some distinct ways that we will see in just institutional structures and laws and overall systems of society operating in distinct ways, but there are going to be some intersections among them. Sorry. All right, so we wanted to identify the different types of discrimination that we will identify in our research. And in order to do that, we start with the field researchers and I. We had a discussion about how we wanted to identify and define both stigma and discrimination in this context. So stigma is about perceptions and beliefs. And discrimination includes actions and behaviors that influence, that's based on those perceptions and beliefs, right? And so we wanted to cover a range of acts of discrimination that may persist in society and used various human rights instruments as well as organizations or advocacy organizations in international contexts such as GLAAD, based out of the United States, to identify what are some of the common areas and areas that would be most applicable to Antigua and Barbuda context in terms of identifying types of discrimination. And these were the ones that we decided on. Verbal harassment, including hate speech, violent or physical attacks, invisibility in social context, and I'm going to talk about these two. Invisibility in social context means basically when persons are engaging in a space and they are purposefully excluded or not acknowledged because they are LGBTI persons, or there is a context in which someone will ignore their presence or not provide service or not provide any attention to that person based on their perception of them as an LGBTI person. Conversely, hypervisibility in social context, that involves drawing exclusionary attention to persons in social context, and the social contexts are brought here, whether when they go to apply for a job, whether they go for a service, drawing unnecessary or unwelcome or discriminatory attention to someone based on their LGBTI status, including in areas of media and entertainment. Then we identified employment exclusion, legal exclusion, restricted access to or exclusion within healthcare. And we identified these three areas specifically, although we could look at all kinds of systemic areas. We found that these three would be the most impactful on the research that we were trying to push forward in terms of policy direction. And also that healthcare, based on our preliminary research and our desk research, proved to be one of the areas that was most studied and also had other public health implications that would allow us to be able to offer some insight by having this as a separate area. So these were the types of discrimination that we considered in our assessment and in the production of our research instruments. Our research design and methods. So where did we begin? We started thinking about by identifying what types of discrimination are taking place and how persons are responding to them, we would be able to assess what two areas that are important in understanding the LGBTI persons. Sorry, I had some feedback. Understanding LGBTI persons in Antigua and Barbuda and the discrimination that they face. And we use theoretical and conceptual frameworks to consider two concepts: resilience, meaning how do they navigate and respond to discrimination, as you will see in our research questions, and empowerment, how does their resilience against stigma and discrimination become transformed into empowerment and activism. And this was an area that we wanted to assess, particularly because it would help inform the eventual goal and recommendations of the research report. We wanted to assess what LGBTI persons were doing and saying and acting on in order to help us understand what would be the main recommendations to come from this research. It is very important in studies like this for us to take into account, for researchers to take into account what the research participants are calling for, what their level of insight is, what their access to their own empowerment, their own activism is, in order for us to frame suggestions that are really coming from the community and coming from those persons most affected by that. We use a mixed methods approach using purposive and snowball sampling. Purposive sampling basically means that we are identifying people within the community who we want to target and we want to talk to. This is particularly because of Antigua and Barbuda as a community is already a small country, and we're dealing with an even smaller community and close-knit community of LGBTI persons who will already have some knowledge of each other and have access to each other. It's also a very sensitive topic, given what we understand about the premise of this research, that persons are facing stigma and discrimination, and there may be some issues related to trust and issues related to access to that community. And therefore, purposive sampling was a decision that we made in order to be able to identify and network with persons who already have access to or belong to that community. And then we would use snowball sampling to engage the other members of that community, by which we mean snowball sampling is someone gets referred based on participation in the research. You recommend someone else and they recommend someone else, etc. So the desk research, we were also employed using peer-reviewed academic research, news reporting, social media and entertainment, policy documents, and human rights instruments were also consulted for the purposes of this research. And our research methods in terms of the data collection in Antigua and Barbuda were as follows. We initially intended to just do statistical data of incidents reported to key stakeholders, including hospitals, law enforcement, and social services. We decided to pursue collection and analysis of intake forms from stakeholders in Antigua and Barbuda to determine the degree of inclusion of LGBTI demographics and concerns. Now, this was a really a key area of interest for us as researchers, because we wanted to assess to what extent at the basic level of social integration are LGBTI persons included in the day-to-day affairs of the country, from a legal, employment, health, education, social services perspective. How many of the forms that we use on a daily basis to apply for services, medical benefits, social security, this is across all sectors, were inclusive of LGBTI persons, either from an orientation perspective, sexual orientation, or from a gender identity perspective, were inclusive. Then we went on to do our semi-structured, our qualitative research, which is where we get most of the data about stigma and discrimination in terms of the uniqueness of experiences. The semi-structured interviews we had with LGBTI persons, cisgender heterosexual persons, stakeholders, and key informants. And then we had 6 focus groups with LGBTI activists, MSM, men who have sex with men, as a separate group. We had a Barbuda stakeholder group with LGBTI community, including activists. We had general stakeholders in statutory, business organizations, and all other government organizations. We had key informants, including police, health, law enforcement workers, etc. Key informants who interface directly with LGBTI persons, and then a youth focus group that was quite insightful for our purposes. The data collected, we used the literature, as we said, the Antigua and Barbuda laws. We consulted laws including the Sexual Offences Act, the Marriage Act, the Child and Children Safety Act. There were many laws that we consulted in the production of this in production of this research. Then we also looked at news reporting, and we looked at stories dating all the way back to, I believe, around 2015. Some prior to that, but most of the ones that we referenced in the research study are from around 2015 and moving forward. We also collected it's about 62 intake forms, and we reviewed existing statistical data. Now, this was a much more difficult area that we accounted for in the research. Review of existing statistical data from police and healthcare workers were much more difficult, but we did get some significant data from the Directorate of Gender Affairs that helped provide some insight into services or people who were visiting the office and asking for referrals to services. So we did get some data there. We consulted with the law enforcement, particularly with the police, and asked for data. One of the comments and insights that we received was how difficult it was to track that data because persons were not necessarily identifying themselves as LGBTI persons when seeking services. And so this is not a data point that was necessarily tracked in the same way, which is an interesting point of the research. And then we collected 106 semi-structured interviews. Overall, that's 15, that's stakeholders. The majority of that, 46 of them were from LGBTI persons. And we had cisgender heterosexual persons. This particular data set was supposed to help us understand perceptions of LGBTI persons in Antigua and Barbuda and to help us understand stigma better. We also had a stakeholders in semi-structured interviews, and then the key informants semi-structured interviews. Each of these categories were 15. The cisgender group was 30 interviews. Then we had the 6 focus groups that I mentioned before. The main challenges and limitations of the research as a whole were, I will go from the specific to the more general. Fears about safety and confidentiality. The field researchers experienced a lot of hesitation, reluctance, canceling of interviews, canceling of plans at the last minute, particularly because persons were afraid of their safety and confidentiality. There were some instances that the location of the interviews were unorthodox because of privacy issues or hesitation by the participants to be part of this research. Now, let me pause at this moment to tell you that we followed all ethical guidelines and ethical procedures, including consent forms, proper storing and storage, communication about data, letting them know how the data would be stored. Everything was anonymous. Participants could have canceled the interview at any time and decided not to participate at any time in the research. And these have all gone through the ethics committee of the University of the West Indies Open Campus. So this study was vetted through an ethics committee. I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge the work and the input that was given from the ethics committee in ironing out those details, particularly related to the sensitivity and the confidentiality of persons. And still, these are very standard things for research, but and some things that we may take for granted as researchers were impactful for the participants, and there were significant fears about their safety and confidentiality. Issues of trust with researchers. Participants sometimes asked if they could bring someone along with them to be present in the research, particularly because they just wanted to be comfortable. This is something we notice in the snowball sampling, because they may have had a friend who was a previous participant and had provided research on what they and recommended them, and they would like to have that person present. So we saw issues of trust and building trust with that community, and I have to really congratulate and commend the field researchers for their work in developing trust and in maintaining that trust in order to complete those interviews and have them the data available. The other issue of trust that came up in this process was comments around what is going to happen with this research. Participants felt that there had been smaller, maybe related studies in the past that they were called on to participate in, different workshops, different research studies, and they did not feel that there were outcomes for the community and major advances being made as a result of that. And they wanted to communicate that to the researchers and say, we want to see what happens next. I am going to participate in this, but I just have to tell you that we just doing research and what is going to change. So there was a certain level of skepticism around what is the product of this research at the end of it. And so I'm very pleased to see that we're taking very clear actions towards policy and towards policy influence at the end of the research process. There was also hesitation to disclose specific gender or sexual identity at first. Again, the work with the researchers, developing trust with the participants, created a better circumstance for us to be able to get data from participants, and that itself was a challenge that was mostly surmountable in the context. And then the biggest one, I would say, is our limitations brought on by COVID-19. As it did for everyone globally, it made it very difficult and very challenging to conduct research in person, to create safety protocols and ensure that especially our focus groups we had to resort to virtual focus groups in a couple instances, and we discussed at length what form those would take in order to maintain issues like privacy and anonymity when we have recorded sessions, how we would approach those, and these were quite difficult. Also, with the shutdown, the various national restrictions that were placed, it made it difficult for people to move, including curfews and things like that. It made scheduling interviews quite difficult and challenging, on top of the stress and the anxiety for all of us who were participants in the study, from the researchers' perspective as well as the participants' perspective. COVID-19 really was an overwhelming part of how we were able to do work on this project. So some of the findings, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about just what we learned in general, and I'm just going to refer. I have to stop here and say that I don't think we can ever be able to capture the richness of all of the findings that we had. These are just the commonalities, but the nuances, the data produced quite a bit of rich research, and I think I'm really impressed with the results, with the individual results from each of the interviews in terms of what data that they were able to put forward for us. And I want to say that it's quite a bit of trying to get 106 semi-structured interviews into a report has been challenging, but I do think that we learned so much from this study. The first thing is the desk research. I want to focus on it a little specifically. I'm getting some feedback. It's just me. Sorry about that. All right. So we saw that strong religious influence on the government's stance on decriminalization of sexual acts. In the UN Periodic Review, we read that while the government wanted to make efforts to towards decriminalization, there was a strong religious influence on maintaining the law as is, and we're talking about the Sexual Offences Act and the buggery laws in Antigua and Barbuda specifically. There was a challenge to moving forward with decriminalization, particularly because of the strong religious influence and religious leadership influencing having strong public opinion and public support for maintaining the buggery laws as is. So this is one of the outcomes of that. The Antigua and Barbuda laws speak broadly against discrimination, but do not provide specific protections to LGBTI persons or children because of gender or sexual identity. Cultural attitudes about gender remain limited to biological understanding of sex, as confirmed by the intake forms. The intake forms across the board were, and this is also confirmed in the research that we're getting in the desk research, in the academic research. This is confirmed by studies that speak to Eastern Caribbean more generally, Barbados and Jamaica as well. There's a lot of research done on Barbados, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, regarding LGBTI persons. This particular issue about cultural attitudes towards gender is consistent across the research, the desk research that we found, the academic research, including what is available, the limited ones that are available about Eastern Caribbean more broadly, because Antigua and Barbuda itself does not appear very strongly as an individual. Maybe there's one study that has Antigua and Barbuda named in the academic research. Ongoing negotiation between public perception and the legal framework. This is coming out from the UN Periodic Review as well. The government is saying that there are attempts, is a general broad laws speaking against discrimination, but again, no specific work has been taken place to provide protections for LGBTI persons in Antigua and Barbuda. Okay, so I want to think about some of the stigma and discrimination issues that come up the most in the research. We had 46 participants, and in the interest of time, I had to make a decision about which slides I would include. But most of the participants were male gay participants, and then we had the second highest was female participants identifying, cis female participants identifying as lesbian, right? So these were just the two, male identifying gay and cis male identifying gay and cis female identifying lesbian as the two highest groups that we had. A majority of the participants experienced discrimination or know of other LGBTI persons who have encountered discriminatory conduct. The most common types of discriminatory conduct are verbal harassment, physical and violent attack, and both invisibility and hypervisibility in social context. There were very few who claimed to have health, employment, or legal exclusion. What we noticed about that is that the interpretation of those ideas were quite interesting. If you look at the data, you will say, well, would you denied employment? And they would say, well, no, but somebody might have looked at them in a strange way or something like that. This gets me to my next point. Despite stigma and discrimination, a large percent of the participants publicly identified as LGBTQ+, and were either comfortable doing so or didn't really address it, but made sure that they said, like, people know, but they're not really talking about it. So most people were publicly identifying. The LGBTQ+ participants rarely experience exclusion in education. One of the things we note about this particular point is that the LGBTQ+ participants, respondents themselves, internalize some of the perceptions, and they saw that glances or untoward comments, they sort of dismissed them and had taken them for granted. Like, oh, well, people just do that. And there was this sort of brush off of it as if it wasn't a real problem. And so you will frequently say, yeah, people just, but I don't take that on, or that kind of comment associated with it. So while they do not, when you ask them the question, they would say, no, I didn't experience that. I don't take people on when they, as if that with the fact that they are not impacted or moved by it makes it like it does not exist. Excuse me. So there was some conflation there, and I thought it was something that we needed to note, that they said that they did not experience it, but there was some normalizing of attitudes, especially within healthcare, of how they were treated. And then some participants conflate gender identity and sexual orientation. Trans-identifying persons, we had a couple interviews where the trans-identifying persons were asking, well, I used to identify this way and I am now identifying this way, well, but I call myself a man. Or in the demographic data collection, they would identify one way, and then when we start talking in the interviews, in the throughout the questions, then there would be another response. So there was some, and even in other responses where you have cis male or cis female, cis participants responding, there would be some conflation about gender identity and sexual orientation. So they would talk about being gay, but also mean being trans, and conflate the idea of being gay with being trans as well, in some contexts where they were specifically speaking about trans persons, and then make an affiliation with sexual orientation. So there was a sort of assumption that for many LGBTQ plus participants, that trans identity also came with lesbian or gay orientation, and they didn't understand this idea that they could be in a hetero, have a different gender as a partner. So there is this conflation about gender identity and sexual orientation in this particular context. Attitudes and perceptions. This is data coming from the cisgender heterosexual semi-structured interviews. They acknowledge that stigma and discrimination exists for LGBTI population in Antigua and Barbuda. So overall, I would say 95% of the data and more said yes. When we asked, do you think that there is stigma and discrimination exists for LGBTI population, they said yes. And most of them would identify it as stigma and discrimination about perception and beliefs, mostly, rather than discriminatory acts like violence and so on. So stigma and discrimination saying, people who identify that they don't accept them, or there is a judgment about it. So most people who participated as cisgender heterosexual persons would acknowledge that. We had one of the things I pointed out in the research analysis was that we have a mostly high school or above educated participant pool for the cisgender heterosexual group, and that influence, there was a correlation between the insight that was received in terms of education of the participants and the views about LGBTI persons. Most of them expressed conflicting views about whether the boundary law should be repealed. While most people would say they don't believe in discrimination, they don't want, they think everyone should have access to rights, there was a lot of conflict about the boundary law should be repealed as part of the Sexual Offences Act. Most people said that they still disagree with the lifestyle and would want it because in one case there was this is just how it should be, right? This idea of appealing to tradition as one of the reasons why the law should stay in place, and it should, and a lot of comments regarding, for protection for children, for protection for society, this idea that the law itself, although it doesn't change behavior or impact behavior, is sort of a statement that there's something sort of morally or ethically wrong with this behavior, and it protects the most vulnerable persons in society by keeping it as part of the law. Youth participants expressed greater levels of acceptance and tolerance towards LGBTQ persons. This came from the focus group data and also youth participants who were interviewed in the semi-structured interview. We had a age category of 18 to 25 across all of the groups. There is less social disapprobation for lesbians than for gay men. This is something that's consistent with the desk research, with the academic research, and generally women were found to be more tolerant and supportive of LGBTQ plus persons than men. So women are generally more tolerant, but also behaviors, and this is consistent with the fetishization of lesbian culture, lesbian identity, and the hyper sort of sexualization by cisgender. This is coming from academic research that supports this view that lesbian identity seems like a particularly attractive fetishized space particularly for cisgender heterosexual men, whereas gay men are more likely to face social pushback and negative attacks based on their sexual identity. And so this what we found in the semi-structured interviews of cisgender persons is in keeping with the research in the desk research. I'm mindful of time. I'm coming towards the end of the findings for now. There's consensus that the government has done little to protect LGBTQ persons from stigma and discrimination. This is coming from stakeholders, key informants, LGBTI persons, and cisgender heterosexual persons, that there has been little done to protect specifically, right? Saying that the government denounces this stigma and discrimination against all persons does not say that the government is doing enough to protect a particularly marginalized and disenfranchised group of persons. And so there is a sense that, yes, the government is saying, oh, we are against stigma and discrimination against gender, race, based on religious identity in these sort of broad human rights categories that speak to a free democratic society. However, there is no law or public policy or public work being done by the government to protect LGBTQ plus persons from stigma and discrimination. There is a failure to acknowledge and account sufficiently for gender non-conforming identities and non-heterosexual identities where other demographic and cultural identifiers are requested. This is coming from the data from the intake forms. Most forms do not have another option besides male and female for sex or gender. Most of the forms actually say sex and not gender. I would say out of the 60-something, we had 2 that had other listed as a sexual, for sexual orientation. There are few forms that acknowledge any other name change or name identity outside of changing your name for marriage. So there were no forms that allowed trans persons to identify themselves outside of the names that they originally were assigned. And so all of these things are failures to acknowledge and account for other identities. And this is not just a matter of cultural, shifting cultural attitudes. This is also a matter of public health. This will impact information in health data and how we are supporting health, law enforcement, education, employment. All of these areas are impacted when we do not sufficiently allow for persons to be included in the demographic identifiers in all across all sectors. Most government service providers reported that they were impartial in their provision of service to LGBTQI individuals and welcomed them in their ranks. We have an example coming from the police force where they said that, in the past, you could not even work in the police force if people suspected that you were LGBTQ of any kind, and now it's sort of a don't ask, don't tell, and the respondents sort of saw that as progress, right? Notwithstanding the fact that don't ask, don't tell is a certain form of invisibility and exclusion in itself. So now most government service providers are saying that they are impartial to it, but there is still a way that it is lacking in its complete understanding and inclusion of LGBTI persons. The state continues to criminalize same-sex intimacy via the Buggery law. This is still on the books and part of the reason why we are having this dialogue, having these discussions and this research. And of course, there are no laws, as I said before, which expressly prohibit discrimination against LGBTQ persons. So this is on the role of the government and how it's impacted in LGBTI discrimination. So some of our broad recommendations, and I know Ms. Gray is going to present and go into some of those. One of the things that I particularly am really in support for based on our standards is that funding for CSOs. I say this particularly because the research, all of the interviews were pointing us toward activist groups, including Women Against Rape, who most of the people who were interviewed had some relationship with an activist organization, an advocacy organization, some type of person or activist in the community who made them feel comfortable and included, right? And that was one of our biggest points of being able to conduct this research, is that the advocacy, the activists, the civil service organizations had access to the community, were supportive of the community, and had built relationships and networks. The activists and advocacy groups are really critical. Civil service organizations are really critical to providing services, support network, and more strategic funding and support from government and other organizations is critical to improving the overall landscape and support for LGBTQ persons in Antigua and Barbuda. We want to address the lack of inclusion. There are several recommendations in the details of the report that will be published about the lack of inclusion, including a campaign to help organizations at the government and statutory and stakeholder level, business level, to increase their to reform their intake forms at all levels, shifting cultural attitudes in terms of talking to persons in the community around the differences between, the different gender identities and sexual orientations, and shifting cultural attitudes, particularly through, again, targeted campaigns in media initiatives and public awareness, and around clarity around terminology. This is a really important point, and not simply for the general public, but also within the LGBTQ plus community as well. There needs to be some clarity. A lot of persons did not know what, including LGBTQ plus persons, did not know what intersex meant, did not know any of the other terms. When we asked them, can you identify all the letters in the acronym and tell us what they mean? A lot of persons had difficulty, and that was within the community as well. And so we wanted to, I think that one of the things that we're seeing out of this is that clarity around terminology, and including that terminology in the inclusive exercise to reform our intake forms as a broad national exercise is one way to improve, to make LGBTI identity a commonplace part of Antigua and Barbuda culture, and shifting the cultural attitudes. And of course, pushing for legal and policy changes, as this research report provides us the foundation to do. And I know that Ms. Gray will follow up in her presentation with some of those legal and policy changes to come. So I think I have done more than 30 minutes, and I thank everyone for listening. There is so much I could say, and I tried to touch on all the main points. I am grateful again to everyone who supported this research project, to InterArts, the EU, and Ms. Wong and Women Against Rape, and the Open Campus, University of the West Indies Open Campus, for the support, and of course the field researchers in putting this together. So thank you again, everyone, and I look forward to your questions at the time when we get them.